All right, guys, so that's what I want to talk about, and this is also part of the last lecture, which was about autoregressive models. Now I'm going to continue with moving average processes next time, but before I do so, I decided to consider basically general principles regarding scientific research, because one of your assignments is going to be about some empirical stuff, so you need to do a literature review. And so let's say a little economic ladder, that's what I would not call it the paper, but I would call it at least an economic ladder. And I want to talk about general principles on how to write a paper. This is what it's going to be about, okay? So first off, again, general principles, next time I'm going to give you some specific ones, okay? Now, the first and the most important one, and if there is one principle which is by far the most important one, is falsifiability. What you write, whatever it is, okay, it doesn't need to be correct, because sometimes you make a mistake. Sometimes you have wrong data, this and that, or data collection wasn't right, or you have different data coming in, generating different results, whatever. So that's not going to be your fault, all right? So what you observe is not something which come from the statistical population from which it was generated, okay? So let's say, what I'm saying is this, okay? So let's say the probability of rolling it, let's say observing 6 on the dice, on a dice roll, right? Would be 1 by 6, but it still could happen that you, let's say, roll the dice 100 times, and you observe 6 100 times. Okay, so that can happen, but it's not likely to happen. You understand what I'm saying? So let's say that sample would not be, let's say, representative regarding the structure of the population which would come from. But that's not your fault. Okay, what you write has to be falsifiable, and I'm not saying it's true or false. This is not what falsifiability means, and you need to understand what this means. For a statement is called falsifiable if basically you can tell, okay, at a certain event, if this event happens, that would contradict. So if that event happens, that would contradict to the statement that you're making. I mean, if I say a statement, and then you would withdraw the statement automatically. Okay, so you define the failure of the statement. So let me put it in simple terms. A statement is called falsifiable if its failure is defined. That's what it is. And I want you to express it as such. Okay, so you're not supposed to, I will give you examples where you would violate this principle and how to avoid that. So, but that's by far, and just let me tell you something. This is by far the most important principle there is. So if there is one principle, this is it, guys, okay? I want you to basically, just give you that one. If you write, let's say, something like, all swans are white, okay? I don't care whether this statement is true or false. That's not what it is about, okay? If that statement is true, okay, let's say, let me rephrase that and ask a different question. Is the failure of this statement defined? And the answer to that is yes, because if you go down the street and you go to a park or whatever, and then you would see a bird, and you could basically, let's say you could tell by 100% that it is a swan, but it's not white. And it's not because it's somebody else was putting color on it, okay? So somebody painted that swan, let's say red or something, okay? That's not what I'm talking about. But you could basically, let's say, you can say by 100% certainty that it is a swan, and you could also say by 100% certainty that it is not white, which it's observable. This event defines the failure of the statement. You understand what I'm saying? And so therefore, this statement is falsifiable, even though, let's say, it is not true. So when I was in Australia, guys, again, so for falsifiability, it's completely irrelevant whether it's true or false. When I was in Australia, I took this picture, okay? And this is, again, so this is my picture. I was in Adelaide and I was observing these birds. But to be honest, guys, I'm not sure whether this is a swan or not, okay? So I'm not an ontologist, okay? So I don't have anything with birds, okay? But let's say it is a swan, then the statement would be the failure of the statement would be defined by that, okay? But maybe it's a goose, I'm not sure, okay? So again, I need to ask someone who is an expert, but I'm not. But again, so let's say even with no black swans or no white, no red swans, no blue swans, whatever, the statement that all swans are white would still be falsifiable. Okay, so even every swan was white, let's say, and let's say that with 100% certainty, the statement would be falsifiable. Okay, because it would, the event that you observe a swan that is not white, okay, can be imagined. All right, so that event would define the failure of that statement. You understand what I'm saying? And you're not supposed to write anything which is not falsifiable. Okay, so do not use any statements that are not falsifiable. They need to be falsifiable. And I'm going to show you where people tend to violate this concept. Okay, so first off, let's say, for example, you want to test whether asset returns are normal. Okay, they would follow the normal distributions. And you might know, maybe in finance, okay, there are some asset pricing models that assume normality of asset returns. Okay, so you could test basically the null hypothesis that the returns would follow the normal distribution against the alternative that they do not. Okay, so there are tests that explicitly allow you to do this by using basically the skewness and the kurtosis of the normal distribution. The skewness is 0 and the kurtosis is equal to 3. So there are tests basically out there allowing you to explicitly test that. And let's say you would find that at the 1% level, you would reject the null hypothesis. Now, let's say if you reject the null hypothesis, you would reject the normal distribution from the empirical perspective, which you can do. But if you write that asset returns certainly do not follow the normal distribution, this statement is not falsifiable, guys. Okay? And that is the reason why you're not supposed to do this. Instead, you should write something like, for example, asset returns do not seem to follow the normal distribution, maybe from the empirical perspective, at the 5% level. So you might add this, you know, so at the 5% level, right? Because that would be basically complete the statement, at least at the 5% level. So I was not displaying that, but maybe you should add this. So I know that you were rejecting the null hypothesis at the 5% level with error probability 5% then. Type 1 error is referring to that. So probability of type 1 error is at most 5%. You would reject the null hypothesis. You understand what I'm saying? So this, although it looks kind of similar, these statements look similar, they're not. Okay, because the latter is falsifiable and the former is not. And that's the reason. Okay, so because why? Because anything that is going to be about hypothesis testing, guys. Okay, so both the null hypothesis as well as the alternative hypothesis is not referring to the sample, is referring to the population from the sample is coming from. So these statements, okay, refer to the statistical population from the sample would come from. And you don't know the statistical population because it is not accessible. You don't have every observation yet. If you have different observations, you would come to different conclusions. And I would expect you to illustrate that, guys. This is very important, okay? If you fail to do so, I'm not going to give you an A. I mean, again, so I'm not sure where to draw the line, but it's not going to be, okay? So again, keep it in mind. So you need to leave the door open, okay? So, and if I want you to express it this way. So if you do it like that, then I'm going to be fine. Maybe you should add, for the sake of completeness, if you do this, let's say you would add at the 5% level, which I would, let's say, like you to do. Okay, so you would tell me at what error probability are you were, you know, making that conclusion. You understand what I'm saying? And that is going to be important, very important, guys. Okay, so check every statement that you write, and because a paper is nothing but a collection of statements, if you say, okay, these statements need to be falsifiable. So this means that their failures, okay, needs to be defined explicitly. Okay, so how would you define it? Is basically depending on the event. Okay, but that's what falsifiability is. It doesn't tell you whether the statement is true or false. Okay, you can write statements that are true, and you can write statements that are false. Okay, you have no idea what the population is. Okay, so that as long as you don't know what the population is, I mean, you know what it is, but you don't observe it because you have no access to it. That's what I'm saying. As long as you the population is not observable, you cannot make statements about the population with 100% certainty. And that's what you need to understand, okay? So whenever you do some empirical work, and that will help you basically with your thesis as well, you need to leave your door open, okay? So you're not supposed to say like, okay, there is a relationship between X and Y. You're supposed to say like, something like, for example, there is a relationship between X and Y from the empirical view, okay? Or our data suggests that that might be a relationship between X and Y, all right? So you need to leave the door open, and then I'm going to be very, very upset if you're not following this principle, okay? Because what you write needs to be falsifiable. Why am I doing this? Because you can distinguish between pseudosciences and sciences, okay, so disciplines, if they are falsifiable. So astrology, for example, or anything that has to do with esotericism, whatever, these things are not falsifiable, okay? Astrology is not falsifiable, okay? So if you think about the statements that astrology makes, okay, that you have, let's say, I mean, the zodiac sign, let's say, would be X, and then somebody claims that it fits to Y, okay? All right, now, it can be the case. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm not saying that I don't believe in it, okay? So that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying it's not falsifiable. So you could not think of any event, guys, that might occur under which you would withdraw the statement. You understand what I'm saying? But it doesn't mean that these things do not have the right to exist, because astronomy, on the other hand, all right, so astronomy was basically developed from astrology. And astronomy is making statements that are falsifiable. You understand what I'm saying? So I'm not saying, and that is true for basically for the other one, chemistry is also a science because it's making statements that are falsifiable. Okay, but astrology, for example, is not. But it doesn't mean that it's not true. You understand what I'm saying? So I'm not saying I don't believe in astrology. Maybe you do. I'm saying the statements that it's making are not falsifiable, and that's why it's called a pseudoscience. You understand what I'm saying? So, and I want you to be basically very careful regarding that. Okay, so leave the door open in that sense that if you, let's say, you would observe different data, you would change your mind automatically. Okay, and that's how you basically do this. Okay, so, and I want you to check every single statement that you're making based on that principle. Okay, even if you just write one statement that is not falsifiable, you can throw it into the garbage can regarding basically scientific principle, because that's what I'm going to look at. All right, so keep that in mind, guys. This is how you distinguish between, or this is one way to distinguish between sciences and pseudosciences. Okay, as long as the failure of your statement is not defined, that statement has a religious character. And if it has a religious character, okay, so it's more like a religion than a science. Okay, but it doesn't imply that religions or the statements that religions making are not true. Okay, you understand what I'm saying? I'm saying they are not falsifiable. If you think about it, you understand the point. All right? Now, what about the next one? It needs to be definable. And I'm going to, let's say, tell you something like this. Some people write, correlation is small. Okay? Then my question is, compared to what? What does that mean? You understand what I'm saying? So the term small is not defined. It can be falsifiable, right? Because, let's say, I have a correlation of 0.99, which everybody would consider to be large, but the question is compared to what? You understand? So that you would change your mind, it would be falsifiable, but it's not defined. So the term small is not defined. And you can write like this, but I need to understand the context compared to what? All right? So that's always the point that I'm trying to basically to make. So, of course, I was taking this statement out of context right now. You understand what I'm saying? So I'm taking these things out of context. If I understand the context, and you provide a context, and then which illustrates compared to what you will basically expressing that, then I'm fine. Okay? But that is not true in general. Yes, you got a question.
What if I write the correlation is relatively small?
That's something else, yes. But that would be fine. Okay, so I was providing you an example with that. But then I need to understand the context. Right? So you need to talk about basically things prior or afterwards. If you want to have a reference, let's say, you can say, sure, correlation is relatively small, but I need to understand compared to what. And that needs to be understandable in this case. So for example, some people write unemployment rate is high. Okay, now if you, let's say, you were talking about Greece and you were talking about Germany, and you would compare the two, and then you would say something like unemployment in Greece is, let's say, relatively high, as you suggest. Then I was understanding the context, right? So you can, again, so this is exactly what you were meaning. You can say unemployment rate in Greece, for example, is relatively high, but then I know relative to what? Namely to Germany, right? In Germany is 5%. In Greece is something like 25 to 30%. I'm not sure. Somewhere around that. At least 20%. You understand what I'm saying? So unemployment rate in Greece is relatively high compared to unemployment rate in Germany. But then I understand the context, so you need to be careful a little bit because that must be clear. All right? If you come up with the idea, okay, correlation is relatively small, then I need to understand compared to what? If you were providing me this information, then I'm fine. You can call it small if you like. You can define it yourself. Okay, so you can say like, okay, if it's less than 0.3, then I consider that to be small, and it's its absolute value. All right, so if it's between negative 0.3 and 0.3, then you would consider it to be small. I'm fine, but that's something that you need to define. You understand? So this is how you come up with the key. So context must be clear, or you would need to define it yourself. There is a categorization. For example, you can provide a categorization of, let's say, income data. You can say low income is anything but basically less than 30,000 a year. But compared to what, right? So if you're in Thailand and you're making 30,000 a year, you're not considered to be poor. All right? But if you live in New York and then you make 30,000 a year, you're probably considered to be basically part of the working poor. You understand what I'm saying? Okay, because 30,000 in New York is worth much less than 30,000 in, I don't know, maybe Johannesburg or something. You understand what I'm saying? So this must be basic. You can define it yourself. Let's say that between 30,000 and 75,000, say you define it to be the middle income, and anything above 75,000, you would consider to be high income. All right? But this is, again, not necessarily, for example, in New York. Okay? Because if you're in London, living in a city, I mean, can you live, let's say, with 50,000? Okay, you would consider it to be middle income. If you live in London, you cannot. It's not possible. Okay? So, but again, so this also depends on where you are, but you can define it yourself. So you can do the categorization. Then I'm fine. So if you tell me, okay, I put everyone who makes less than 30,000 to be a low income, that's fine because you're defining it. All right? But that needs to be straightforward. So you need to justify your categorization. How would you justify that? Why would you consider it to be basically someone who's making less than 30,000 a year or making 30,000 a year to be basically part of the low income category? All right? It depends basically where you are also. Okay? If you're in London, that makes sense because you cannot live at 30,000. But if you're basically maybe like, I don't know, places like Vietnam or, you know, Bangkok, you're not basically poor if you're making 30,000 a year. All right? Compared to what? That's always, I mean, how we define poverty then, but that's something that I'm not going to talk about. You understand? So it needs to be defined. Now, sometimes you can basically get away from this, okay, if you use certain expressions. In general, relatively speaking, under certain circumstances, whatever that weakens basically these things. So you can be smart. If you use smart, you use these expressions because what does usually mean? Okay, what does maybe mean? What is that? What is that supposed to be? Under certain circumstance, all right? Okay, that is clear. You understand what I'm saying? But although that has the same meaning, all right? So the right-hand side basically sounds a little bit more advanced and the left-hand side is not, although they might be equal. Anyways, okay, so it's not that clear. So if you go from one category to another, where to draw the line, it's difficult to tell. But it needs to be clear from the context at least. You understand? Now, regarding the introduction, guys, please, and this is going to be rule number 3, please pay special attention to the introduction. Because if I read your introduction of your paper and I look into the reference list, right, then I actually know by 80–90% what you're going to have, okay, most of the time. So but the problem is the introduction can only be written after the work has been done, okay, because you don't know what the introduction, what it's going to be before, after. You only know this after you finish the paper. So after you finish your paper, then you write the introduction in most cases. Maybe you can add the motivation and whatever, but that's not what I'm going to be about. So again, please pay a special attention into introduction. When I was a student, nobody told me this, okay, but everybody was expecting me to do it, okay, so I'm not basically telling you, okay, so I wish I knew that, right, so before I was a student, so at least what I'm going to tell you, all right, so the introduction is going to be important. Now it's approximately 10%, 12% maybe, that would be a good start, 12%, 1/6, maybe, or 1/10, 1/7 of your total paper. So if you write 10 pages, it should be, let's say, not more than 1.5 pages, but not less than 1 page. All right, so at least have 1 page, but not more than 1.5. So you don't need to write 2 pages if you write 10 pages. Okay, so have at least, let's say, make sure that the volume is approximately somewhere between 10 to 12%. 12% is basically a good part. 1/8. No figures, no tables, no formulas, guys, when it's empirical. Okay, so if you write a theoretical paper about, let's say, mathematics or even applied mathematics, then you could add formulas. I'm fine, but you probably won't. So if it's economics, don't use formulas in the introduction at all. Okay, you need to basically, because I want to understand it. Okay, and I'm not telling you this who is familiar with these things. So I want to understand what you're doing, and everybody else does. I understand if you write formulas, but it takes more time to consume it. All right, so again, no partition, so you don't need to split that. What I'm saying is this: you don't need to include chapter 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and so forth. Okay. Because if you cut the pizza in too many pieces, it doesn't taste good. That's the reason. So you need to, again, so if you write 1 page, let's say you write 10 pages or so, you don't need to cut that page, right? Why would you? Okay, so there is no need. If you write 300 pages, and then you have, let's say, 30 pages of an introduction, then you can split it, because it would not be digestible for me, at least, reading 30 pages straight. You understand what I'm saying? So then you can split, but you don't need to. So you're not going to write more than 2 pages regarding the introduction. And I can digest that very well, so, because you're not going to write more than 20 pages. Okay? At least, maybe that your thesis is going to be longer, but not in this course. All right? So you write maybe small papers or whatever. Now, regarding introduction, it always consists of 3 parts. There is the motivation and the problems that you're illustrating. That's number 1. This is going to be about how to sell your paper, guys, to me regarding your topic. So you need to sell your topic, and I'm going to show you how to. Later, I'm going to give you some examples when it comes to specific principles, how to do that, okay? But not this time. So this is going to be the first part. Let's say this consists of 30% of your introduction. So if you, let's say, write 1.5 pages, this is going to be, let's say, half of a page, or let's say 25% of a total page, guys. Okay, this is going to be about that part. Now, the greatest part is going to be the next: objective, results, and the context. And I want to have all 3 of them. So you need to tell me explicitly, guys, explicitly, what are you doing? If I don't know what your objectives are, okay, right at the start. So you explicitly. So you write something like, this paper is about blah, blah, blah. Or we are going to blah, blah, blah. Do something. Right? So you need to write that down explicitly. That's number 1. If this is missing, I'm going to complain. And I'm going to complain extensively. You understand what I'm saying? Because it's not like, riddle, where I need to put your stuff together. You tell me what you're doing explicitly. Understand what I'm saying? After that, so after you sold me your paper, your topic. You need to sell me your topic. That was part 1. Okay, so here you sell me your topic in part 2 of the introduction. You explicitly tell me what you're doing. Okay? And I want to have the results. All of them. I repeat, all of them. So what you have figured out, let's say you did some empirical work. You want to analyze whether there is a relationship between X and Y from the empirical perspective. Then you write down whether you find a relationship between X and Y. Okay, so I want you to tell me this paper is about examining whether there is a relationship between X and Y, and our results suggest that there is a relationship or there is no relationship at the 5% level. That's it. And I want you to write that down explicitly. If this is missing, guys, I'm going to complain. And my colleagues are going to complain too. Just for your record, okay? If you don't tell people what you have figured out, okay? In the introduction, on page 1, that's going to be your first page. People are going to complain, all right? So you should tell who the murderer is, guys. It's not just like, you know, a fictional text where I would need to read the text first and then figuring out who the murderer is later on the last page. You understand what I'm saying? Like Agatha Christie or something. If you you like reading stuff like that. Okay, when I was young, I read all these, you know, murders and whatever. Okay, so you need to tell me who the murderer is at the beginning. You understand? If you don't, and I need to look it up, I'm going to complain. And you need to understand. You give me some context. Now, what about the context is going to be referring to the scientific literature. Okay, so you need to address what the literature says, whether there is relationship between X and Y or not, because usually there is nothing new under the sun. You understand what I'm saying? So somebody was taking your topic at some point, somewhere, maybe even in a different context, but kind of resembling to it, you know. So I'm not saying it's going to be one-to-one what you did, but I want you to basically talk about that too. So what is the context of the scientific literature? Is there a consensus, yes or no? Usually there isn't, okay? So there is, to my estimation, there is no such thing as a scientific consensus. Because if there is consensus, then it's a religion. You understand what I'm saying? So science is supposed to be about, you know, questioning stuff, okay? So if you're not allowed to question it, then it's not science. You understand what I'm saying? So, but that's a different story. Okay, so most of the time there isn't. But maybe there's a group of people who argue strongly in favor or in opposition to a certain statement. I want you to tell me what the general context would be regarding the scientific literature. If you fail to do so, then I'm going to complain. Understand what I'm saying? But you need to talk about yourself too. So maybe your results are basically constitute a contrast to the results of X, Y, and Z, or is consistent with the result of X, Y, and Z. I don't know, depending on what you figure it out. Or you do this for a different country, and then your results are different, whatever, or are consistent with somebody else's. I don't care. I mean, I do care, but it depends on the topic, right? So you need to tell me about that in general terms. Not, I mean, you can say X, Y, Z did this, and, you know, he came up or she came up with different results, but only, let's say, relatively superficial. So I want to look at the scientific context, not in details, but let's say maybe there's a general context, and I want you to talk about that. And later on, there is just a small percentage, so this is maybe about 5% of your introduction regarding the structure of your work. One sentence to maybe every chapter there is. Okay, so you can tell me something like, in chapter 2, we're going to review the literature. Chapter 3, we're going to do some empirical stuff. In chapter 4, we're going to discuss them. And chapter 5 summarizes everything, stuff like that. Okay? I'm going to provide you with specific examples regarding that. So, but you can check any paper there is. Let me start by the first one. Okay, so what about the motivation? Because that is going to be important for me. So why is your paper worth reading? Of course, I mean, I don't want to be cynical, guys, but the answer to that is, of course, because I got paid. That's the reason. Okay, so for me, I mean, there is a motivation. All right, but I'm not talking about finances. Okay, I'm talking about you selling me your paper and we're selling everybody else. Okay, so you need to understand what it is. I'm going to use that paper. So this is a theoretical one. It's also related to finance. So it's going to be, it was about continuous time modeling, stuff like that. And then he would argue that it becomes or became a useful tool in finance, whatever, continuous time finance, stuff like that. So some things like that are going to be relevant. Maybe you do some volatility forecasting and then you tell me that it's going to be playing a major role when it comes to risk management, stuff like that. You know, so you need to forecast volatility maybe or something. You know, so this depends on the topic as well, but there needs to be some relevance, okay? There needs to be some relevance of your topic and I want you to tell me about it. You need to have a reference to it. So I'm not saying like, okay, social media is important because my girlfriend got an account on Instagram and she got 50,000 followers or something. Okay, I'm congratulations, but you know, you need to put that in the right context in that sense. So I want to have a reference. Okay, why is this important? So you need to quote someone regarding it because somebody else was talking about the topic too and you picked it up and you're making a reference to it. So that's the reason. Now, there's always some problems involved regarding an important topic because, you know, some people might argue that social media causes depression. Well, and depression is a problem. So that might be a case that social media is a problem, okay? People who spend a lot of times on Instagram, that's usually, or social media, this is a red flag for me. You understand what I'm saying? So there are people like, you know, looking every 5 minutes on Instagram, their accounts, you know, who texting me, stuff like that. You know, if I see this, I run. You understand what I'm saying? So that's a red flag for me, okay? You can check once or twice maybe, but it should be basically within certain levels. Anyway, so there is always problems involved, and I want you to talk about them, okay? Maybe regarding volatility clustering, it could be a volatility forecasting. Volatility could be stochastic, time-dependent, whatever, deterministic. It's not clear, you're going to examine. So this is always a reference to it and a certain issue, okay? For example, regarding continuous time models, the issue with continuous time models is relatively difficult to implement them, okay? Because that involves, you know, stochastic differential equations. You need to discretize them, you need to approximate them, you need to estimate the parameters. Relatively difficult to do, okay? Although, so that plays a major role, but it's relatively difficult. So it can be a little said about the dynamics specifically, and the other issue is going to be that it's relatively difficult to implement them. But if it's important, how would you address the implementation? And that's what he suggested. So he was addressing explicitly that issue. He suggested a procedure basically by which you could implement these models relatively easily. That was his job. But that's what he was suggesting. But he sold the paper based on that. You understand? So he was basically giving an instruction on how to implement these things. And that's what, you know, this paper was about. Okay? Now, again, after that, this is basically the argument why I would read your paper and how you could sell it. But I want you to basically to make references on these points. So if you say, okay, these things are important because blah, 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 I want you to justify that by the literature. You understand what I'm saying? So not because you are considering it to be important, but there is always a justification and there is always a problem that arises and that you would need to address. Now, what is your goal? And I want you to tell me explicitly, again, explicitly what your goal is and what your results are. He was writing like this. In this paper, we describe blah, 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 and implement blah, 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 blah. So you don't need to know the details. But that's what he did. He was documenting something, and he was telling me that he was documenting it. So I want you to tell me what you are doing. Okay? You were estimating blah, blah, blah. Let me know. Okay? So I want you to write that down explicitly. Or maybe you're providing a literature review on a specific topic because the topic is important and everybody discusses it. Okay, tell me. All right? So this case, you need to start the sentence in this paper, we are blah, blah, blah. Okay? If you write we, I think it's more convenient because as a reader, I feel included into that consideration. You can write, okay, I am God, I did that. Okay, congratulations, but it sounds a little arrogant. So, but it's fine. So I'm not going to blame you if you are like narcissistic and stuff. Okay, you can be. I'm not blaming you for that, but it's more inclusive if you say we. I mean you and me as a reader. Okay, so I can join you in that sense. All right, now you need to address the problems that you were talking about. So maybe you were addressing them in a specific way. Okay, so that's what also he did. Closed form expressions are problematic, let's say, in this context. Okay, and he was basically solving that issue, and you were also basically contributing to something. So whatever you're doing, you're contributing to something, and I want you to tell me what you're contributing to, even though somebody else was doing your work prior. You want to maybe check that work, so, or whatever, control it, whatever. Okay, so I want you to be basically telling me what other people have done in the context of a scientific literature. Okay, but I mean, he was doing that, so basically what he said is there are other methods based on blah, 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 blah. So he was not the first who was talking about that issue, but he was recognizing a problem that he solved, and this is what his paper was about. Okay, so maybe you can say something like, it's not clear whether X is correlated with Y, so we are contributing to that discussion in that brand, because if you look at this and this in data, this is what we figured it out. And I want you to basically tell me what other people have done in this part. All right? So summarizing it. So in context of basically what have other people done as a summary. Okay? So you're summarizing these results. Okay? And then you put that into the introduction too, so I understand the context. All right? So far. Okay? And yeah, so that's something that you need to do. And then the introduction must contain our results. Every single one of them. Okay? So wherever you find basically significance between X and Y or not, you need to tell me. Okay? And I mean, you're a reader. So you say, okay, we were examining whether X correlates with Y, and you're like, okay, our results suggest that it does. Maybe in contrast to, let's say, to the authors A, B, and C, or inconsistency with D, E, F, or I don't know. Again, so it depends on or it might not be clear. So maybe you were saying something like, our results contradict themselves. Then that's your result. Okay, so maybe you do procedure A, you have something else coming out as maybe you would do procedure B, because again, nobody knows what these statistical populations are. So, but I want you to tell me. So you need to summarize it, and if you don't, then it's going to be an issue for me. All right. Now, all relevant results from the literature in context, so you can flip it. You can start with the literature first, and then you talk about yourself, or you talk about yourself first, and then to the literature. So you can mix it anyhow, but you have to have a reference. I always suggest you talking about yourself first, and then you make a reference to the literature, and then you go back to yourself. Okay, so maybe you can follow that one. And the structure is going to be just one sentence of each chapter. So this consists basically about, this is about just, let's say, 5% of the introduction. Maybe 1 or 2 rows. Okay, so then you write maybe 5 or 4 chapters and not more, typically. All right, now, okay, that's number 3. Number 4, I need to understand what you're saying. And you need to write it in such a way that you need to create a possibility for laymen to understand it. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the laymen do. Okay, so you're not supposed to make it understandable for everybody, but you need to create a possibility for everybody to make it understandable. What I mean by that is this. So I'm using basically formal expressions. The declaration of variables is basically one major issue where people violate that principle, okay? But not only regarding it. So basically, our regression model yields, and then you write something like R squared is equal to 0.123. Okay, that should be fine. I know what you're meaning. You mean the coefficient determination. That's what I assume. Okay, but my girlfriend probably does not know what you mean. Okay, so she cannot access your paper and she cannot Google it. You understand what I'm saying? So she doesn't, I mean, I don't know whether she knows what coefficient determination is. I didn't ask her, and I don't intend to, you know, so, but maybe she doesn't know what it is, and you would not referring to it. So you need to explain that this is your coefficient determination, because if you don't, you don't declare your variable. You understand? So, and that's what you're supposed to do. So no, again, so she doesn't know what R squared is, because she hasn't seen that notation before. Okay, she probably doesn't even know what coefficient determination is. But if you write down that this is blah 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 coefficient determination, she could Google it. Okay, and then she might understand it. Okay, I might ask her. I'm not sure. All right, so that's something that you need to understand, and I want you to basically to be aware of that every single variable that you might use them, you might not, need to be defined in terms of declaration. Okay, so if you write it like this, where R squared denotes the coefficient determination, then you were declaring this expression. But I'm like, okay, if you use that, then the question is why? So why don't you simply write, okay, the coefficient determination is 0.123. I'm fine with that. So if you don't use the formal notation, then why are you declaring it? You understand what I'm saying? So you can simply write coefficient determination of the regression is equal to this and that. Okay? Yeah. All right, so you're documenting it. You understand what I'm saying? This comes back to another principle, which basically other people don't follow. So for example, how would you declare formal expressions? But that's a common mistake. So if you, let's say, write that the stock price follow this equation, okay, then you can write, okay, for example, that these are the parameters. So by that you declare them, okay, whatever these parameters are. Okay, these are parameters. So simply just putting that greater than 0, for example. Why not? And W denotes the so-called Wiener process or Brownian motion. Some people refer to it as Brownian motion. Now you might not know what it is. And I assume you don't. Let's say 80–90% chance that you don't know what a Wiener process is. Then you could Google it. You understand? So if you miss that part, okay, if you miss that, right, then, okay, what are you supposed to do with that? You understand what I'm saying? So that's going to be an issue. You cannot Google a stochastic differential equation. That's not yet. Maybe in 5 years or so you can. Well, you can put it ChatGPT and something, and then you get an explanation what the Wiener process is. It's a theoretical process, by the way, with certain characteristics, which I'm not going to discuss. Okay? But maybe you, if you read the definition, you would understand it. All right? So that's what I'm talking about. Now, in this case, if you don't need to reintroduce these variables again. So if you use it again, which you do it here, you don't need to declare it twice. It's enough if you declare it once. You don't need to declare them twice. That should be fine. Okay? So if you're making a reference to that, then you're making basically a reference to where it was declared, namely in the first equation. So either right before or right after you were introducing it. But you need to use it. So if you don't use it, don't introduce it. All right? In this case, I use it because I want to explain what the solution is to that differential equation. Okay? But that's that. So if you don't use it, don't introduce it, right? You don't need to declare them again if you have used them already. Okay? Now, the rule number 5 is going to be basically simple. Mean what you're saying and say what you mean. Okay? There is people who don't do that. So I want you to basically to tell me about this. For example, in the event of default, the performance of an asset return is negative. Now, what is the performance? Okay, what does that mean? And what is a negative performance in particular? Now, I think, you know, the author who was written, I mean, I was taking these things out of seminar papers, okay? So I assume that the author who has written that would basically mean that the stock price or whatever that asset was has decreased, you know, okay? But that's what the assumption was. But what would be basically a performance? I mean, he made, you know, the assumption about, you know, he had maybe a portfolio or something. And then the value was basically decreasing of that portfolio, right? But that's not because, you know, the performance in case of an asset return would negative. Because if basically prices go down, you can still make money. So then your performance will be positive because you would gain something, okay? If you have basically a put option, maybe you have the right to sell the asset at a certain price. You're making money if the price goes down. You understand what I'm saying? So it's not what this is about. So I assume, again, so what is negative performance? That relates to the second principle because that's not defined. And I assume that the stock price or asset price, maybe it was stocks, I'm not sure, asset price was decreasing. Okay? But why don't you write the asset price tends to decrease in event of default, which doesn't make sense. Okay? If the company goes bankrupt, then prices tend to go down. Okay? Not necessarily, but maybe somebody jumps in and then the price tends to go up again. But again, who knows? So that's not what basically what was meant. And maybe you can something like this, asset returns tend to decrease. Yeah, that's what I was assuming. Okay? But that's not necessarily what it is. Okay? Because again, if the asset returns decrease, you can still make money. So you can have a positive performance regarding your portfolio. All right? So, but again, you need to mean what you're saying and you need to say what you mean. Okay? You're not supposed to be ambiguous regarding that. Okay, now next part is this. So always stick to the point. Again, and I see people violating this. Okay, so when I was receiving, let's say, a table of contents, okay, and I saw, I mean, that was, you know, the final thesis. It starts at page 19. Okay, because jump diffusions, and you don't need to know what it is, but these were jump processes. This thesis was starting at page 19. Okay, that's not what the topic was about. Okay, so you can also, I mean, you need to tell me something about pricing options in general, or maybe one or two sentences, or maybe you talk about stochastic processes in general terms. This is something that you can do, or you talk about the Black and Scholes model. But if you write something like this, okay, that this is not what the topic about, so it starts at page 19 out of, let's say, 30 or something. Okay, you're probably not going to write 30 pages in this course, but I want you to stick to the point just at the beginning, page 2. Okay, after the introduction, you need to start. Okay, again, so maybe you need to talk about a little bit of that, but not too much, because then it changes your subject. You understand? So in this case, you need to focus on your topic right at the beginning, after page 2. Okay? And if it's shorter than even on the first page. Okay? So again, don't make that mistake, guys, because this is something that you need to be aware of. Now, if something is redundant, leave it out. Again, maybe something like an introduction of variables. Some variables are redundant. If you say sample consists of n equals 62 observations, why would you need that n again? So if you don't need that, then why would you using it? Okay, so do not introduce them if you don't need them. Okay, you don't basically. I mean, some people tend to show off, like say, okay, n is always a sample size. Okay, that's fine, but I'm not going to the supermarket and I'm like, okay, I want to buy n equals 5 apples or something. Okay, so people will tell me I'm crazy. Why would you say just simply I want to buy 5 apples and that's it? Okay, so if you don't need that, don't introduce that. Okay, so people tend to show off by these things, but you cannot impress me with that, because if you don't apply that formula or you do nothing with that, then why would you introduce it? So simply just say sample consists of 62 observations. That's fine. Okay, if there is no necessity to include that variable into the consideration. If you do consider that, then okay, then you can use it. So it can be useful. I'm not saying it is, because maybe let's say later on you say like, okay, arithmetic mean equals 1 by n times the sum of all observations. Okay, fine. Then I see the necessity for that, so then you declared it what it is. That should be fine. Okay, so in this case it's fine. But if you don't tell me or you don't use the formula, then why would you introduce it? Okay, so why would you introduce the variable if you don't need it again? Okay, it doesn't generate any loss of information if you just leave it out. Okay, again, but in case you don't use it. So if you introduce it, I'm expecting you to use it then. If you don't, then leave it out. It's redundant. Okay, so some people, I mean, that was a seminar. Okay, so that was kind of shocking me because the author has provided me with this table, and the topic was real estate financing. Okay, and future perspective. Okay, now tell me what the first impression, whatever that was, I have no idea, has to do with real estate. You understand what I'm saying? So, I mean, maybe it does, but it was 200 years ago. So, why would I care? You understand what I'm saying? So, again, if I mean, I'm not, okay, of course, I'm taking this out of context, but you need to convince me that I need these goddamn table to understand what real estate financing is. Future, guys. You understand? That was 200 years ago. Has nothing to do with the future, unless you convince me. You understand? So, the author was trying to impress me that with some knowledge about these things and whatever. Just don't. I mean, again, you need to stick to the point. So, why would you tell me what these things are? I mean, I don't know. Again, maybe Great Depression, that was also 100 years ago. So why do I care? You understand what I'm saying? It has nothing to do with real estate, and it has nothing to do with financing, and it has nothing to do with the future, and it has nothing to do with perspectives. You understand? So I always ask myself, okay, do you need that information? If you don't, leave it out. Okay? You should go for quality instead of quantity, at least in my case. Okay? You take class over the mass. Okay? But that's the principle. Okay? So why would you include a table like this? I don't want to basically laugh about that, guys, but these are mistakes that I made. Okay? So I made mistakes. I mean, I made every single mistake there is. Okay? So I'm not going to blame you, but at least somebody should tell you. Okay? So if it's redundant, doesn't mean anything. Okay? It has nothing to do with the topic, then why would you tell me? Especially not in the introduction. Okay? So that's something that I would like you to do. Okay? Redundant sentences, as we have illustrated in section 3.1, then I will criticize the structure. So if you roll back, okay, maybe basically you roll back, which you can do, but I would basically criticize you for that, because then you would need to set the structure up a little bit differently. Of course, in the introduction, you talk about that first, and then in the following parts, you go into the details. But if you have the feeling that you need to roll back, then you might change the structure then, okay? So you don't, basically, you're not supposed to rewind your paper then, okay? Now, again, if you say something like, I mean, you can use aphorisms, okay? I'm not blaming you for that, but why? Okay, so this paper was about M&A, investment banking, and there was a quote basically about truth and stuff. Okay, so this is philosophy, but why would you need that? I mean, I don't, guys. If you write a book and then tell me, okay, for my family and stuff like that, that should be fine. Okay, so, but this is just a seminar. Okay, not a, I mean, okay, you need to take that seriously. Okay, so I like aphorisms. I do. I really like them. But this is about investment banking, guys. Okay? So this worked. And, okay, it was German, so I was not translating it. I couldn't find the original. But, again, so that's something that I want you to address. Now, how to quote them. So when it comes to statements, basically, now what to quote is just going to be about scientific papers. Okay? So do not use newspapers, magazines, stuff like that, Wikipedia. Don't quote them. Okay, you can use Wikipedia if you want to look up things, but don't quote it because it doesn't, to my estimation, it doesn't meet scientific standards. Okay, I mean, if everybody can text it and edit it, how would it be? Okay, so even basically people would argue, okay, blocks, comments, sections, blah, 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 don't quote this, unless you write these, you write a scientific paper about these things. So maybe you write a scientific paper about Wikipedia, which I'm not assuming. Then, of course, you need to quote it because, you need to make a reference to it. But again, as long as you don't use it, only use, basically, please, only use scientific papers. Okay, how to quote them, and that's going to be, you only use the last names in the text, and then in reference list, you basically display the full source. Okay, with every single detail. I'm going to talk about that next time. Okay, so in the text or in the footnotes, whatever, you use the last names and the year of publication, and that's it. No titles, no volume number, no pages, nothing. Okay, but in the list, you tell me everything about it. Okay, I'm going to show you basically to tell you explicitly how to. Okay, but that's it. So maybe there are multiples. Okay, so if you have more than, let's say, 2 authors, then you can write it like that. So Chan et al. Okay, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. 4 authors. Okay, so that takes a lot of time to write them down. Yes?
I have a question. For which reason is it wrong to quote newspapers if you want to write a paper about?
Because it doesn't meet scientific standards. That's the point. Unless you write a scientific article about newspaper. That could be one exception. So there are exceptions to this. But you're not supposed to. Because it doesn't meet scientific standards. Now maybe you can make a reference to it's something like, okay, this information is also important for the public. And then you quote a newspaper, maybe to illustrate the relevance of your subject. But since newspapers don't meet scientific standards in general, you're not supposed to quote them in general, but there might be exceptions to that rule. So I'm willing to basically accept that, but in general, this is not going to be the case. All right? Now, okay, I'm going to talk about these general principles. I'm going to finish that part next time, maybe. So I will talk about that more in detail and specifically. And I'm going to do that next week. So I'm going to stop here. And next time I'm going to finish that part. Okay, guys? All right, so unfortunately, I'm running out of time and I don't want you to be late for our next lecture. But this is where I will stop. Okay? And so don't forget your next assignment, for which the deadline is going to be next Friday. All right, and see you next Wednesday. And next Wednesday I'm going to finish that part. Okay. All right, guys. Yes. Thank you very much. Take care. All right. Okay. So there is 1, 2, 3, 4. Then you simply just write. For example, you start by the first, and then you write et al. And then that's it. So then, because it might be too long. Okay. So, and then this is what you use basically in the text. All right? That's supposed to be clear now. All right? Now, anything that you list basically must be also quoted at least once. That's obvious. Somewhere. Okay? It could be an appendix, could be anywhere, but it must be quoted at least once. If you don't, it's going to be an issue. All right? So anything that you basically put into the list must be quoted at least once. And anything that you basically quote at least once must be also basically cited in the list as well. So if you don't, this is a one-to-one correspondence, of course. Okay, so you're not supposed to just write, okay, you use this book, and you use this book, and that one, and that paper, and that article, whatever. Then it should be fine, but you need to also tell me where you were using them. Okay, and if you don't, that's going to be an issue. So please pay attention to that one as well. This is basically the third thing that I'm going to look at. So first thing that I'm going to look at is going to be your introduction. The second thing that I'm going to look at is your reference list. And the third thing that I'm going to look at is whether basically anything in the list is also quoted at least once in your paper at some point, somewhere, okay? And if you fail to do so, then it's going to be an issue. So these are the 3 things that are very important to me. And if you meet those, then of course I will look into your paper in more detail. But that's how I start, okay? And if you fail those, let's say, then it's going to be very difficult to come out, just for you to mention, okay? So if I look into the sources that you use, if I look basically your introduction, and if you use, and then I will check whether you use your sources appropriately, if you don't basically meet those requirements, then it's going to be very difficult to come out. Okay, so to turn it around and into your favor. So just for you to mention that. Okay, so an 80-90% chance I already know what I'm going to give you after that. So I have to go through that, and anything else is just, you know, more or less formal. Okay, so I want you to basically to be, I mean, pay attention to those things. Just if you make. Okay, next regard. Yeah, you got a question. Sorry.
Yes. Sometimes there are books that are just simply a collection of many papers.
Yeah.
Can we?
I think in that case, if you, yeah, you can use that books. All right. So after basically, books appear after, let's say, 10 to 20 years, if the paper becomes standard. Okay. But if you have the papers, why don't you quote the original source instead of just basically a transmission, right? So I think it would be a better idea in most cases. I'm not sure whether there are exceptions, but I think in most cases it would be a better idea to quote the original source instead of just basically, you know, a transfer material. But again, to you, of course, you're free to use anything you like. So you can use, again, you can use Wikipedia with, let's say, a list of papers, if there is an article in Wikipedia, but you're not supposed to quote it in that regard. But if this book is scientific that you are mentioning, maybe you recognize this by the author, so it's always someone who collects those papers who was writing papers himself on that topic. Okay, so you're supposed to, I mean, you can recognize it, but it's supposed to be a scientific one, and if it is, of course, you're welcome to use it. Anyhow, you can quote it yourself, but I think it would be a good idea to quote the original sources.
Yeah, but sometimes
predominantly,
in the library we just have like the book. Like for example, I want to write a paper about some work of Friedrich August von Hayek.
Yes.
And they are just the collections of the papers, but the papers itself in the library. So
if the paper, you don't find the papers themselves in the library, or what?
yes.
Well,
I have the book in the library.
But still, I mean, if the book contains a paper, why would you quote the paper? You know. So suppose, I mean, it doesn't really matter where you find it, as long as you find it. Okay, whether it's in the library or not, whether it's in the book or not, doesn't really matter, right? So maybe it's online. It's if you talk about Hayek, it could be an old one, so it was not probably digitalized. But I think these things are becoming more and more digitalized. So I think there is a great chance that you would find the paper that you're looking at online. All right. I'm very pleased that you're reading Hayek, by the way. But that's just me. All right. Okay. May I ask you, what are you writing about or reading about? Or is it just see?
I also study political science.
I see.
And I want to write something about the Euro crisis and that program. I want to.
Yeah, that's a good source. Okay.
How does the Austrian school?
I see. Good. Great to hear. Just so you actually great to hear that you're talking about the Austrians. All right, great stuff. Okay, all right. Okay, guys. Yeah. So regarding the appearance, again, all I'm asking you is consistency. Also, there is no specific type of, you know, text, font size, whatever that you're supposed to use. Okay, so just be consistent regarding your format. You can use any format you like, actually. I like Century Schoolbook, but because that kind of resembles this one. Okay, so I use Word to edit that document, but it's kind of looking like LaTeX. Okay, so LaTeX is also an editor. I put basically a link to the Word formula editor that you can use, but there is also LaTeX. You might not be familiar with that one. This is what basically scientific researchers use most often. Okay, so LaTeX is a paper, but you can also use scientific words, so that kind of looks the same. So again, the font that I'm using here is not from LaTeX. It's a Word document, and it's called Century Schoolbook. So you might want to use that. Okay, but you don't need to, of course. So you can You can use any font size or any font type you like to. I don't really care as long as you're consistent, all right? So regarding that, basically I find it better if you just split, the paragraphs accordingly. So here it's not that visible at the top. But again, I don't really pay attention to those things. But if you can't make it good, at least try to make it look good. So, and if it's consistent, then that's what I'm talking about, okay? You should take out the double empty spaces, for example, so you can check whether there is double empty spaces, because I see them even in a PDF document. So after a while, you're going to see these things. Again, I'm going to ignore those, but if I see it too many times, though, too many inconsistencies, it kind of distracts me, so that's what it is, okay? So you're not supposed to create that illusion in that regard. So you're not supposed to be using things that distract me from your original content. Anyways, okay, so again, later on you should read a lot, okay? So that's what basically what I'm trying to also mention, because I'm not sure how to express this and how to basically illustrate that concept, because this is something that is, I think, more subconscious. But the more you read about the topic, the more it becomes visible somehow when you write a paper about it. I cannot explain why this is or how I'm getting that impression. So, because, you might use the words in the right, accordingly. So you kind of adopt the language that these authors use. Probably that's the key. So you start adopting the language that the authors use, okay, when you read the scientific papers intensively, and it becomes visible, okay? And again, but this is more or less subconsciously. So I cannot identify how I am basically, recognizing this. But it becomes visible, and that's always a good sign. So if you're familiar with the topic, and basically, then that's always a good sign, no matter what you're writing in that regard. And you should read a lot in that regard. So the question is how to basically get those things. And I want to talk about that as well.